Hello. My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I am director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism here at the university. Welcome to Lady Margaret Hall for the Reuters Memorial Lecture in 2019. Our speaker tonight is Siddharth Varadarajan, whom many of you will know for his long and distinguished career in Indian journalism, working for the Times of India, working for the Hindu. Siddharth has also been an academic. No one is perfect. He was editor-in-chief of the Hindu from 2011 to 2013, and in some ways this already sounds like the kind of sort of build-up where you wonder, well, where do you go from there? And I think Siddharth was asking himself this very question after having left the Hindu, and in 2015 the answer was clear. Siddharth was amongst the 3 people founding a new non-profit journalism venture in India called The Wire that's committed to journalism free from commercial and political pressures, something I think many of us in this room might immediately think of as a good thing. It's also clear that there are millions of Indians who appreciate the work that Siddharth and his growing team are doing. Many of you will have heard of some of the stories that they have broken, including the golden touch of Amit Shah. It's also clear that there are 1 or 2 people who are not so pleased with journalism that is free from commercial and political pressures, at least judging by the growing number of people and entities who have sued Siddharth and his team over a wide variety of different issues in their coverage. And I think we will hear something about what it's like to practice investigative journalism in an environment like that. We will hear a lot tonight about India specifically. I think it's also really worth highlighting that India is not only of incredible intrinsic importance, being as it is in that sort of much trotted out cliche, the world's largest democracy, something that may be a cliche but is very important nonetheless, an incredible achievement. But it's also, I think, something that the rest of us should recognize is in some ways a media environment that may foreshadow what many of us in the rest of the world have been seeing for a long time, are increasingly seeing, or may see in the future. A media environment that is mobile first, a media environment that is heavily dominated by platforms in terms of distribution of content online, a media environment in which people are coming online in incredible numbers and at a credible pace. Since the last Indian elections in 2014, there are elections coming up later this year, an estimated 250 million Indians have come online. And in the course of the 90 minutes or so that we will be here together tonight, another 18,000 or so Indians will come online for the first time. The pace of development, I think, is incredible. The environment is not only digital, and increasingly so, it's also one that's characterized by things that I think we can recognize from other parts of the world too, and perhaps learn from the Indian experience. We see political populism of various sorts. We see elements of political polarization. We see low trust in many institutions and many political figures, and more broadly, weak institutions and considerable pressures on freedom of the media. India, of course, last year was ranked 138th in the world in terms of press freedom, and the issues around that are growing by the day. Now, these are problems, perhaps, but there are also, if you will, a space in which journalism matters to an extraordinary degree. Is it possible to do journalism in that environment? Siddharth will give us his answer. I suppose sometimes when I go and learn from the experience of people like Siddharth in India, I sometimes try to carry with me the assumptions of Western journalism or European and sometimes North American journalism. I think in particular of an observation that was made by the CEO of a continental European newspaper company that shall remain nameless on this occasion, who said at a meeting in Brussels, well, we all know you can only do proper journalism if you make at least 150 million euros a year. I think that's an interesting observation, and I think we can all understand where it comes from. But I think it's also as important as it is to reflect on the decline of that kind of journalism, also important to look at the examples of people who do important and inspiring journalism with fewer resources than that. So Siddharth and his team, 35 people or so, publishing to an audience in the millions in 4 different languages and have broken some of the most important stories of India in the last couple of years. I won't say more about your journalism or the context in which you operate. I will just welcome Siddharth and then look forward to the lecture and the panel discussion chaired by Alan Rusbridger that will follow. Siddharth, welcome to Oxford.
There's no clock here, so let me fish my phone out. Right. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to deliver this lecture today, and of course to the audience for coming here. It's gratifying that there is interest in the work we do at The Wire and indeed on the state of the media in India as a whole. And what I will hope to do in the next half an hour is to essentially give you my perspective on give you my perspective on the current state of play as far as the media is concerned, and of course what lies ahead in the years to come. As if the future that I was contemplating when I first discussed the subject of this lecture with Rasmus a couple of months ago, as if that future was not bleak enough, the coverage of the aftermath of last week's deadly attack on Indian security personnel in Jammu and Kashmir by the Pakistan-based terrorist group, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, suggests in many ways what lies ahead is even worse. I don't wish to get ahead of my argument, but just to bring everyone here up to speed, the killing of over 40 Central Reserve Police Force personnel in a suicide car bombing has led to unprecedented and, of course, wholly understandable national grief. But it has also led to shrill demands for revenge from a Prime Minister and government who are only too happy to revel in this shrillness as a means of avoiding questions about the failure of their Kashmir, Pakistan, and counter-terrorism policies. From the vantage point of the media, of course, what should worry us is our failure to ask those questions in the first place. Just last month, speaking at a convention of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party in Delhi, Defense Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said how it was thanks to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's firm and decisive leadership that the government had managed to ensure that there had been no major terrorist attack in India since 2014. The claim, of course, was false, as there have been many attacks that one would classify as major. But even when the Kashmir incident occurred on February 14th, no reporter or editor sought her response in the light of what she had just said a few weeks ago. The fact is that many editors and television anchors, in their zeal to be the news and drive the news, have shed any pretense of reporting it. Some channels have built war rooms in their studios where the pros and cons of different forms of revenge can be discussed. In primetime discussions, any voices urging a relook at the so-called military option or who question its utility are shouted down as anchors call for, quote-unquote, the social ostracization of individuals who are supposedly pro-Pakistan and not standing by the nation in its moment of grief. The positions taken by the government's political opponents are subjected to minute scrutiny in order to see how they might have been responsible for the suicide bombing. Obviously, there has hardly been any analysis of what role official policies might have played in this tragedy. As the hot air from the big channels mixes with the toxic atmosphere on social media, the range of targets has also broadened. A senior politician from Punjab, Navjot Singh Sidhu, who is currently with the Congress Party, was relentlessly trolled simply for saying one should not blame an entire religion or nation for the crimes of a few terrorists. Not only was he trolled, Sidhu was eventually ousted from his regular slot on a popular television show in the face of a relentless social media campaign where demands were being raised for the boycotting of this channel if they didn't act to eject him. Other victims of this quest for revenge have fared even worse. Kashmiri students in different parts of the country have been harassed and intimidated, with a major section of the media preferring to remain silent about this. Now, the jingoism of a major section of the Indian media is not new, nor indeed is it unique to India. All democracies, at one time or another, get swept up by the rhetoric of revenge and war. People in the United Kingdom know this only too well. But what makes the bloodlust of the Indian media especially alarming is the coming together of three broad trends that have adversely affected the independence and integrity of the news industry by allowing the government, the ruling party, and big business houses a greater than ever role in shaping and determining the agenda of the media. The first of these three trends is the increasing unviability of the existing business model as the move to digital reading habits further undermines the revenue base for all but the biggest media players. This has both increased the dependence of the media industry on advertisers and made them more vulnerable to government pressure of one kind or another. The second is the effective use of social media as a disciplining device. Whenever individual reporters or editors or even media houses stray too far away from the officially mandated line. And the third is the growing resort to legal means, sedition law, the Official Secrets Act, slap suits, defamation cases, etc., as well as extra-legal means as a way of penalizing individuals and media who refuse to fall in line. To be sure, each of these factors or trends do not always operate in a seamless or linear fashion. The digital revolution, for example, has made large media houses vulnerable on the financial front, but it has also enabled small, scrappy players like The Wire or The Quint to come up. Similarly, the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party's so-called IT cell, the information technology cell, which is the sort of army of individuals mobilized to be active on social media on behalf of the party, this IT cell or the PR machinery deployed by a large business house like the Adani Group can achieve considerable media traction through their efforts, but so do our stories. For all their toxicity, Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp have allowed The Wire and other smaller media platforms to level the playing field when it comes to distribution. And hopefully that will remain the case until such time that governments succeed in exerting some form of pressure or the other in the future on these distribution channels. But these are exceptions. Whereas the rule, thanks to the way that these three factors operate, is that the media in India is becoming more monopolized, more regimented, and weak-kneed, incapable of subjecting the government and other powerful sectors of society to basic accountability. And I'd like to talk you through, in some detail, each of these three factors separately. Apart from the largest newspapers in each geographical territory, most newspapers in India would be completely unprofitable were it not for government advertising and other kinds of rent that they are able to collect. In the case of television, the situation is even more dire. The fall in print and television advertising revenues has led to a windfall for Google and Facebook as advertising content shifts onto the digital sphere, but not for the big media companies whose content still drives the maximum readership traffic. Now, different media houses in India have responded to the revenue crunch in different ways. Apart from slashing news gathering costs and resorting to, I'm sorry, I messed up your screen. Okay, help. apart from slashing news gathering expenses and, okay. I'm a Mac user, so this is all, Windows machine is completely strange to me. So in response to the sort of financial pressure, the first response of media houses has been to just cut back on news gathering expenses, and we've seen this across the board. This is not uniquely Indian, you have this around the world. But also a shift is visible in India towards opinionated news content. This is particularly true of television, because opinionated news content, news quote unquote, because it's not strictly news, is cheap and easy to produce, and its gladiatorial quality is often helpful in attracting advertising. In addition, many media houses have resorted to a number of sharp practices in order to squeeze revenue out of news as we know it. Paid news, that uniquely Indian contribution to the media industry, was born out of this process. Last year, a small website, Cobra Post, ran footage of a sting operation it conducted against a range of large and small media companies, where its reporter, its undercover reporter, posed as a godman, as some kind of religious person, who he would approach these media houses with the proposal of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars for so-called religious programming that would have political overtones and be aimed, in his own words, at supporting the ruling BJP, and which would also polarize voters on a religious basis. So he was very explicit in his presentation in bringing this business proposal to a whole range of media outfits. And all of this is kind of captured on camera. So you have this guy coming, very shady character, making what looks like a terrible proposal if you're an ethical business company, media company. But what's surprising, or maybe not so surprising, but shocking certainly, is that of the 24 or so media companies that were approached, only 2 showed this godman the door immediately and said, look, we're not interested in discussing your proposal. In media company after media company, this guy was granted successive meetings. He was passed up the food chain by managers who felt that he should meet an editor, he should meet a CEO. In some cases, the CEO of a big media company was involved in negotiating how this person could even pay cash instead of writing a check for this material. And this expose basically lasted about a day. Apart from us and a couple of other websites, nobody bothered to report it. And even though many of the media companies that were stung made very brave noises about filing court cases, and 1 or 2 of them claimed that we were doing a reverse sting on this reporter. But it's been a year now, and there's been no information or evidence of any kind that these media companies were really onto him and planning or are going ahead with the court case. So and that was I picked that because it's a classic example of how widespread paid news. I mean, this shows you not just paid news. In other words, somebody coming, offering money, and negotiating column inches and time on television as part of news for his agenda. And media companies, knowing well that this agenda is divisive, has the potential even to cause violence, are nevertheless willing to embrace it. And in many ways, this goes to the heart of exactly how rotten current business practices in many media organizations has become. Now, governments come into the picture, and the reason this is not just a malaise in and of itself is because governments come into the picture because there's always a threat of regulation of paid news, cross-media holdings, which media companies fiercely resist. Then many news organizations have taken to organizing large events where the presence of top ministers or even the Prime Minister can be leveraged to millions of rupees worth of corporate sponsorship. Some media houses have business interests running across other industries. One prominent newspaper wants to diversify into education, where I am reliably told the return on investment is much smarter than in the media. But for that, they want cheap land, which means knocking on the door of a minister and essentially currying favor with the government, because only governments have the power to allocate land on the cheap. All of this naturally generates points of pressure for political parties, for governments, for ministers, to keep the media on the straight and narrow. And looking into my crystal ball, I see more and more of this happening in the years ahead, further weakening the editorial integrity of the Indian media. It is not a coincidence that we have a Prime Minister who does not believe in holding press conferences or answering unscripted interviews. Normally, politicians seek access to the media, even if this access means not being fully in control of the messaging or the narrative that emerges. In the case of Mr. Modi, however, he has been able to use Twitter as a communications force multiplier for his messaging. And this brings me to the second factor, which is defining the contours of what lies ahead for journalism in India, which is social media. Last week, the Times of India, which is the country's largest and most profitable newspaper, issued an extraordinary apology in its columns and on Twitter, and I quote, "Many of our readers have expressed concern over the headline," and it quotes the headline now, "Government blames Pakistan after local youth rams CRPF convoy with IED-packed SUV in the worst ever J&K terror strike." Now, of course, if you ignore the Indian media's love for abbreviations and focus on the headline itself, essentially the newspaper, going by the kind of noise that this headline generated on Twitter, the newspaper was essentially guilty, in the eyes of its detractors, of referring to the person who caused the suicide bombing as a local youth. And it's, when I read several dozen complaints online against the Times of India, you had irate readers saying, "Why didn't you call him a terrorist? Why have you called him a local youth?" Whereas the headline clearly refers to this as the worst ever J&K terror strike. So there is no ambiguity about what this attack is all about. But the newspaper goes on to say, in its apology, the Times of India says that the headline clearly said it was a terror strike. There is nevertheless, and I'm quoting from their apology, there is nevertheless a feeling that the headline conveyed an impression of Pakistan being unfairly blamed. While fully appreciating these sentiments, we wish to point out that our entire coverage was unambiguous in stating that the terrorist was a member of Pakistan-based and controlled Jaish-e-Mohammed. In fact, there is a detailed report on Pakistan's intelligence agency increasingly using Jaish as its sword arm to organize terror attacks in India. And they end with this line, "Times of India condemns terror and grieves for the families of those martyred in Thursday's attack." Now, reading this abject apology, you would imagine that the newspaper committed some terrible sin with this headline, but as I said, its headline is essentially factual. And what apparently outraged people on social media was this failure in the headline to refer to the perpetrator, not as a terrorist, but as, the failure to refer to him as a terrorist and instead to go with the descriptor local youth, a fact that is absolutely germane to the story. Yet the Times of India was forced to grovel. Now, this is the case with the largest newspaper, the most profitable newspaper, in a situation where journalistically, by any reasonable yardstick, there is nothing wrong with this headline. I can find other subbing problems with it, but in terms of the content, it's certainly nothing that warranted this kind of an apology. And I mentioned this in this lecture essentially to illustrate the very complex relationship that has now emerged between social media and the media. In my view, social media feedback serves a very useful purpose, at least theoretically, in enabling a real-time two-way conversation between editors and their readers. Twitter, for example, helps us realize mistakes of fact, errors of all sorts, and to have them corrected quickly. But when this interaction takes the form of politically influenced mass mobilization and campaigning, the consequences for media freedom can be quite deadly. Unpopular opinions and perspectives can and are squeezed out. Looking to the future, how the Indian media negotiates its way around the democratic promise that social media carries, while avoiding its obvious pitfalls, will in large measure determine its future evolution. In my view, media editors, driven largely by the chimera of advertising dollars, are already way too dependent on social media trends when it comes to organizing their news priorities. It's not uncommon in newsrooms to have news editors actually literally look at Twitter trends and demand frantically from journalists why they haven't produced stories that fit these trends, even though these trends by themselves are not something that you could validate in terms of a journalistic priority. Let me now turn to the third factor shaping the future of the media in India. The Wire will soon be 4 years old. Our annual budget is around rupees 7 crore, or approximately $1 million. But we are facing a dozen defamation cases from some of India's most powerful businessmen, in which they are seeking 11,450 crore rupees, or approximately $1.5 billion worth of damages. Read the list. It's a who's who of the government's backers. Gautam Adani, Anil Ambani, Subhash Chandra of Zee Television, Rajiv Chandrasekhar of Republic TV and also a member of parliament for the government, Sri Ravi Shankar, a godman who supports the government. And of course, the case that, or the story that Rasmus referred to, we have a famous lawsuit by the BJP president Amit Shah's son, Jai Amit Shah, for a story that we did 2 years ago. In addition to civil defamation cases where financial damages are sought, India is one of the few democracies who still have criminal defamation on its statute books. And we, apart from these 11 or 12 civil cases, are also being prosecuted under criminal defamation in 4 or 5 of these cases. Typically for the same story, the plaintiff will file civil and criminal charges to ensure maximum harassment of the person that you're acting against. Now, the Wire isn't alone in being slapped in this way, to use the acronym for strategic lawsuits against public participation. The TV channel NDTV has a big case, as does a small website called The Citizen, and Caravan, which is another magazine doing great work. And there are, of course, many others. All of these cases are frivolous, but they are filed not to be seriously contested, but to embroil the media in endless litigation that they can ill afford and are poorly equipped to handle. When I was the editor of The Hindu, I had 2 defamation cases filed against me by the then Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu. And I'm reliably told that even though she's no more, those cases apparently will linger on. However, I never had to waste time as editor briefing lawyers or reading their long briefs. I just signed the papers brought to me by the legal department. If you are a small organization, as The Wire is now, you can't afford that luxury. especially when pressure of various kinds is also being exerted on those who donate money to the wire. And since we are a not-for-profit, donations are a big part of our revenue model. In at least 2 recent cases, in which the promoters of NDTV and Quint were targeted, law enforcement officials turned up in pursuit of obscure cases and attempted to harass and intimidate the 2 news organizations. These are tactics that we have seen before and are aimed at signaling to the whole media that this kind of intimidation and harassment using the income tax people or other government agencies is also very much an option. In the state of Manipur, in India's northeast, a journalist has been sent to prison for a year under an administrative order for using harsh language, or rather rude language, in a Facebook video that was critical of the Prime Minister and the Chief Minister. This kind of legal and extra-legal overkill has also been used across the country to arrest and intimidate ordinary citizen critics. Individuals who would otherwise be celebrated as citizen journalists, perhaps, who use social media to voice sharply critical or satirical views against the ruling establishment. To give you an example, in the state of Uttar Pradesh, a year and a half ago, shortly after a new chief minister was elected, this is a chief minister against whom several criminal cases were pending for inflammatory, for hate speech, essentially. And as soon as he became chief minister, he made an announcement that now that I'm chief minister, all criminals will have to leave the state. I'm going to be so tough on law and order. So this young kid, 16-year-old guy, 17-year-old guy, put up a Facebook status message saying that this is what the chief minister says, that all criminals will have to leave the state. I suppose he will have to go too. And the police essentially filed a whole battery of charges against this kid, including sedition, including violations of the Information Technology Act. We have this horrible law called the Information Technology Act, which in some ways criminalizes speech that would not be considered problematic were it to be expressed in print or on television or in a meeting. But because electronic means are used to disseminate this information, somehow this becomes sanctionable. And so sections of the Information Technology Act were slapped against this guy. It took him several months to get bail. I'm not even sure if the charges have been dropped, even though he's currently out. But this is just one example, and in virtually every state, you have many such cases of kids, people being targeted for a Facebook post, or in some cases for liking somebody else's Facebook post, or for putting up a Twitter message that annoys somebody who has some clout with the police or with the government. At the same time, pro-establishment social media commentary, no matter how inflammatory, is those kinds of comments never attract the sanction of the law. Attempts are never made by the police to track down who these people are who are spreading these messages. A couple of years ago, a video went viral on Facebook and WhatsApp. It showed one guy. Well, the description of this video was, watch how a Muslim is brutally killing a Hindu in Bihar. And the clip was of this guy wearing a cap, Islamic cap, basically killing somebody on the road. And it turned out, after this video was investigated, that it was a clip of a fight between 2 political activists in Bangladesh. It had nothing to do with India. It had nothing to do with Hindu-Muslim. But it was being circulated by people associated with the ruling party. But no, in cases such as this, which is clearly something that falls foul of India's hate speech laws, action is never taken. But instead, stuff that is critical of the government typically tends to attract the attention of the police. And of course, relief from the courts takes time and can be a bit of a crapshoot, a bit of a gamble. Eventually higher courts tend to be quite strict about enforcing the rule of law, but by the time you get there, you've spent a long period of time either being prosecuted or being incarcerated or whatever. So what lies ahead? And I want to now come back to the issue on which I began this lecture and essentially draw some concluding threads. It seems to me that we are entering a very dangerous period for freedom of speech and expression in India, and consequently for the media too. One powerful and influential section of the media has already crossed over to the dark side and is actually complicit in the ruling establishment's view that there is too much freedom. The government, in fits and starts, has been talking about the need for greater regulation of the digital sphere. Ministers promote the myth that digital media is legally unconstrained, unlike print and television, a claim that is belied first and foremost by the wire's own experience. So if the political trends of the last 4.5 years continue, I would expect greater pressure on the legal front on independent media, of course couched in the name of combating fake news, which is the cover or the alibi that governments adopt when they want to act against coverage that they don't approve of. Sadly, extra legal pressure on independent media will also likely increase. It is not uncommon for individual reporters and writers to be subject to death threats. Women with strong opinions are especially targeted on social media. Gauri Lankesh, a courageous editor in Karnataka, was assassinated 2 years ago for her views by a fanatical Hindu chauvinist group that has drawn up a hit list of others too. Jingoism, war hysteria, and phony terror threats to national security have also been used to further clamp down on dissent. Ridiculous cases based on the flimsiest of evidence have been launched to go after prominent lawyers and academics like Siddharth Varadarajan and Anand Teltumbade. Make no mistake, if the establishment is able to get away with this, next in their crosshairs will be journalists and media organizations. I would like to end on a final point. Journalists and the media can and should fight the good fight to uphold democracy, but they can only be effective if the wider institutional ecosystem has integrity and respects the rule of law. Structurally, the media in the United States suffers from many of the same ills as the mainstream media in India does. But Trump is still subjected to greater pressure and scrutiny than Narendra Modi is. One reason for this is that the checks and balances on the exercise of vindictive power by the executive seem to work far better in the United States than they do in India. Given the systematic manner in which one institution after the other has been undermined in India over the past 5 years, the Central Bureau of Investigation, the Reserve Bank of India, the Election Commission, the Comptroller and Auditor General, the University Grants Commission, even the judiciary, I can go on and on. Given this trend, it is possible that the system of checks and balances in India, so central to the preservation of democracy and liberty, but also media freedom, will see further erosion. In all this gloom and doom, it is hard to think of what silver lining the media in India can look forward to as it contemplates the future. Yet, we must soldier on in the hope that the reader, viewer, citizen loves her democratic rights more than anything else and will recognize that unless the media is able to do its job independently, it'll be good night and good luck for democracy too. Thank you very much.